Good afternoon. My name is Milbree Rainey, and I serve as the Assistant Director at the Children's Commission. On behalf of the Commission, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Representing Children with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities in Child Welfare Cases. Our speakers for today's presentation will be Dr. Mackenzie Hughes, Clinical Psychologist and Assistant Professor at Texas Children's Hospital, Dr. Casey Swick, Pediatric Neuropsychologist also at Texas Children's Hospital, and Kate Black, who is an attorney with Disability Rights Texas. This webinar will address the diagnosis, testing, and treatment for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities and considerations for judges and attorneys in child welfare cases. A copy of today's PowerPoint will be posted on the Children's Commission on-demand training and MCLE webpage. For those watching the live presentation, the Q&A feature is available and questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation if time allows. Additionally, the MCLE number and TBLS information will be provided at the end of this presentation. If you're watching the webinar replay, you may email cctraining@txcourts.gov for MCLE self-reporting information. And it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Mackenzie Hughes to get us started.
Thank you all. Today I will begin by defining what intellectual disability is, or IDD. IDD refers to an intellectual and developmental disability, which is a disorder that is characterized by significant limitations in both the intellectual functioning and the adaptive functioning of someone, and it's typically diagnosed in the developmental period before the age of 18. So those two criteria, the intellectual functioning, refers to an individual's mental capacity or their abilities to reason, problem solve, abstract think, engage in judgment, academic learning, in addition to learning from experiences. And in order to meet part of the diagnostic criteria, you have to be 2 standard deviations below the mean, which is typically a full-scale IQ score less than 70. Adaptive functioning is our behaviors and how we cope with the demands of life, and can be categorized into a variety of different categories, including conceptual skills. These include our language, reading, writing, and arithmetic skills, social skills related to interpersonal functioning and navigating our social world. And then finally, practical skills, things like activities of daily living, personal care, safety, and kind of navigating the world. And again, you have to be 2 standard deviations below the mean as it relates to your adaptive skills. One way I like to think about these 2 different groups is IQ is related to our thinking skills, and then adaptive functioning is related to our doing skills, the behaviors that we're able to do. IDD can be characterized in 4 different severity levels: mild, moderate, severe, and profound. And those severity levels are based on the individual's adaptive functioning or their doing skills. And the reason for this is because this helps to determine the different services that a child may require. Next slide, please. I'm going to just briefly clear up some common misconceptions that I hear within my clinical practice. Oftentimes I hear things like, well, the child's IQ is less than 70, so they have an intellectual disability. Again, an IQ less than 70 does not necessarily mean an individual has an intellectual disability. It is that combination of both intellectual disability or intellectual functioning and deficits in adaptive functioning. IDD is one diagnosis under a larger umbrella of neurodevelopmental disorders, things like autism spectrum disorder and learning disorders. Although IDD does often correlate with things like autism spectrum disorder and learning disorders or disabilities, they are 2 distinct different disorders. It's also important to highlight that IQ is generally a stable construct, but it can be impacted by things like trauma, the environment and inconsistencies regarding the conditions of the evaluation. And we'll talk about some important considerations regarding timing of those evaluations in future slides. And then finally, it's very important to recognize that children with intact cognitive abilities who have IQs closer to the mean can still have significant deficits related to their adaptive functioning or their doing skills. And this is often based on limited experience. So if a child has experienced profound neglect, they might have deficits related to their activities of daily living, but don't necessarily meet criteria for an intellectual disability.
Tips for attorneys. We're just going to try not to make assumptions. As Dr. Hughes pointed out, we often hear things like they're smarter than they seem, or they must not have tried on the IQ test. We don't want you to assume what your client can and cannot do. You can ask the caregiver, you can ask the client themselves, what do you think your strengths are and where do you think you need support? Engage on their level. Use accessible language. We tend to talk in legalese and polysyllabic words, and it's really important that we use common, regular, everyday language. I often like to start by saying at the beginning of a visit, if I say a word you don't understand, you can raise your hand or stop me, and there's no reason you should know every word I'm going to use. And starting every conversation that way, because these kiddos need repetition, helps them feel comfortable pointing out when they don't know a term that you're using. You can also use an overview of the conversation to help them have choices. So what do you want to discuss first? What do you want to discuss later? Or you can say, I have 3 topics. Which ones do you want to begin with and which ones do you want to end with? Next slide, please. You're going to want to check for understanding often. As lawyers, we tend to talk and we can kind of drone on for 20 minutes straight, but it's really important that we stop and check in with our kids and clarify our own understanding. So what I heard you say was, or I think I got what you're saying, and make sure to repeat it back to them so they can say, no, that's not what I meant. Avoid yes or no questions, especially, does that make sense? Is that okay? Because clients with IDD will often just nod and say yes, even when they don't understand. Offer to write or draw main points can be a useful device. And also judges, if kiddos are attending your court, consider creating a mechanism in your court for kids to stop and say they either don't understand a word or don't understand a concept. That can be a card that they can raise or their hand, but allowing them to stop and say, can you please explain that better, allows them to participate more fully in court.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a bit more about diagnosis and assessment in practice. So one piece that felt important to highlight is that there's a difference between the purpose of a neuropsychological evaluation and a psychological evaluation. So the two can have different goals. So a neuropsychological evaluation, often the focus is on clarifying diagnosis in the case where there may be a medical diagnosis that has a direct brain impact. And we'll talk a little bit more in the next slide about what that could look like. But the focus is on a comprehensive cognitive evaluation, really with this emphasis on drawing connections between brain and behavior relationships. So what is the functional impact of a condition or disease or injury that impacted the brain on the cognitive, behavioral, academic functioning of a child? In contrast, a psychological evaluation, really the emphasis is more on a psychiatric, behavioral, social, emotional condition. There tends to be more limited cognitive evaluation. And so really, we're sort of screening for cognitive factors that could be influencing the emotional or behavioral functioning of a child. But they're two separate goals, where one, the emphasis is really the question is about cognitive impact versus screening out a cognitive impact that could be ultimately impacting behavior. And so to give some more concrete examples of what that could look like,
One of the pieces in our discussions in creating this webinar is that really, if we're thinking about seeking out a psychological or a neuropsychological evaluation for a child, there should be a referral question, right? These are specialty evaluations. It's not as if you're going to a primary care checkup for just kind of a physical or a routine screening. These are specialty evaluations. So just like you wouldn't go to a neurologist and say, well, just check, right? You should have a question for why you're there. And so similarly, there should be a referral question for these that may help guide whether you're looking for a neuropsychological evaluation versus a psychological evaluation. So some examples could include, what is the impact of the child's recent traumatic brain injury or TBI on their cognitive, behavioral, or academic functioning? So this was a direct brain hit, right? And now we're wondering what the impact may be, what changes there may be in the child's functioning as a result of that injury. Some other examples could be if a child has epilepsy and they've had a neurosurgery, or we've changed medications and we're wondering about a cognitive impact. Really, again, a neuropsychological evaluation, the primary question is cognitive, where you need an in-depth, multi-domain cognitive evaluation to answer that referral question. In contrast, a psychological evaluation, you may be wondering, how are symptoms of ADHD, trauma, or depression impacting the child's behavior? And in this case, again, we may be screening for cognitive factors, but really the primary question is about the child's behavior and what could be impacting the child's behavior. Keep in mind, in these examples, we're considering that these kids don't have a known medical condition that could be directly impacting their cognitive functioning. Again, if the question is just sort of academically, we can see this kid is really trying and yet they're not able to keep up. What could be contributing to their difficulties in a classroom setting, for example? So to give just a brief context about our scoring. So Dr. Hughes mentioned falling 2 standard deviations below the mean. So if we're looking at our lovely normal curve here, IQ tests are based on a normative sample. So that is, these are kids that have no known cognitive, medical, behavioral, academic, social, emotional problems. And so when a child comes in for an assessment, we compare their performance based on the performance of other children their age, but with no known problems. That's our normative sample. And so our IQ tests typically have an average of 100. And if we're thinking about intellectual disability or a score that's less than 70, that 2 standard deviations below the mean, we're talking way out in the tails, right? Where typically 2% and fewer of the population are scoring that low on the testing that we're doing. And something that we'll talk about a little bit more, but it's important to consider that our measurement comes with error and variability. There are a lot of different things that can influence how a child is able to even engage with the type of testing that we may be doing. That's important for interpretation, especially if we're making decisions that affect them in the long term. Typically with our testing, a full-scale intelligence quotient, or the FSIQ, is generally thought to be the best estimate of overall intellectual functioning, but there are times when it may not be, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of those examples. So the WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, it's now on its 5th edition. This is probably the most common test that you're going to see when you're looking at psychological or neuropsychological evaluations of children. And to give just a little overview, the full-scale IQ is made up of 5 different index scores. And so that includes verbal comprehension. This is things like your vocabulary knowledge or understanding verbal concepts. For example, in what way are red and green alike? And they get increasingly abstract and complicated. There's also a visual spatial index. This is something like your ability to mentally rotate and put together puzzles, ability to make 3D blocks look like a 2D picture. We have fluid reasoning. That's another nonverbal, but really has to do with more reasoning through patterns or understanding sort of the basis of numerical concepts or the basis of some math concepts. Then we have sort of what are more of cognitive efficiency skills. So something like working memory, or how much information you can hold in mind just for a brief period, and then maybe manipulate it. So for example, if I gave you a list of numbers to remember, could you say them back? And then if I gave you a list of numbers, could you tell them back to me backward? We also have a visual version of this that's almost like those picture memory tests you may have played as a kid, where how long of a span of pictures can you remember in order? And then lastly, we have a processing speed index, how quickly you're able to do something like visual shape matching or writing different symbols. It's a coding task, but it's important to remember if you're thinking about the child you may be working with, our processing speed measures include a written component. So if you have a child with profound motor difficulties, these are things that we want to keep in mind when we're thinking about interpretation, for example. So super briefly, one thing to cover also is that there are different types of evaluation of intellectual functioning. So there are more comprehensive measures like the WISC or some others that I've listed here that you may see, but there are also screening measures. So the Wechsler Abbreviated Scale of Intelligence, or the WASI, is a screening measure where instead of several indices, we're looking at just two, and I have a visual explanation of that here on this slide. So this is just an example. Don't be afraid of the numbers and all of the data that are showing up on this screen, but it's really just to give you a visual representation of how much data we are interpreting that goes into a full-scale IQ when we do the WISC or an in-depth IQ measure versus something like the WASI or an abbreviated measure, where the WISC, again, we're looking at 10 total subtests, 2 for each of those 5 indices, all together that go into that full-scale IQ score. As where the WASI is a screening measure of intellectual functioning that doesn't take into account those efficiency skills like working memory and processing speed. And you can either give a 2 subtest version, like 1 vocabulary test and 1 block design test to get a full scale IQ, or you could give all 4 subtests to get an abbreviated full scale IQ. So just again, something to consider if you have a child who's being retested, for example, who had maybe a WISC during a school evaluation and they had a WASI during a psychological evaluation, that full scale IQ might look differently, and it may be because of the in-depth nature of the evaluation. So just for you all to have for your knowledge. And then briefly, it's important to remember again that our tools for measuring IQ are not perfect or magical. They're not a crystal ball, and they don't tell us everything about a child, right? So our tools are incredibly culturally bound and can be biased based on a child's exposure. For example, if a child has never had formal schooling before, they're coming out of a situation of neglect, for example, we may not expect that their vocabulary is at an age-appropriate range, and that could be due to an underlying cognitive problem, but it may also be due to a lack of exposure, right? And similarly, in Texas, I think we come across this a lot. It's important to take into account acculturation and language exposure or dominance of a child when we're doing our testing. So if a child is not proficient in English, and then we test their IQ in English, even tests that are nonverbal in nature, our instructions are verbal. And so if they don't understand English, they may not be able to understand our task instructions, for example. So again, these are also activity-based. And so a child's ability to engage in the testing on the day of testing with that particular examiner can also lead to poorer looking performance that may not be related to IQ, but may be related to behavioral factors that interfered with their ability to engage with the evaluation. So for this reason, it also can be helpful to consider the overall profile of the child's performance rather than just looking at that one IQ scale score alone. Sometimes there can be big variations in scores, and it can be due to something other than intellectual disability. So when we're thinking about assessment of adaptive functioning. In contrast to our cognitive assessment of intellectual functioning, adaptive functioning is typically measured based on standardized questionnaires for caregivers. So that could be for parents, for foster parents, for teachers, but it's based on an informant's report of the child's behavior. And so it's not typically based on direct evaluation or assessment. And really the goal of these is to report on the child's independence with particular daily living skills. So not just, can your child get dressed in the morning, but is your child able to do that independently without significant prompting or reminders or support from someone else to do that? Other information that's important to consider is if we have a developmental history of the child, access to school records. As psychologists, we always complete a caregiver interview to get more of that in-depth background beyond just the standardized questionnaire reports. But it's super important, especially for children in the welfare system, right, to consider how long has the rater known the child? Is this just a transporter who's dropping the child off at the appointment? Or is this someone who's been able to know and observe the child for a considerable amount of time? And also, what are the opportunities and or expectations for a child's independence that could vary based on setting? So for example, if a child's in a residential treatment, they not only would probably be expected to make their own meals, but they may not even have the ability to watch how a meal is made, right? So it's important to consider what is the level, what is the expectation, and also opportunity for them to try some of these things out independently. In terms of, okay, now you have a neuropsychological or a psychological report that's come across your desk. What can you be looking for as an attorney or as a judge or someone trying to advocate for a child in this situation? So as a neuropsychologist, I would tell you read the whole report, but I also understand the reality and we write very long reports. So if I could tell you to look at anything, I would say, look for, in typically the behavioral observations, is there a comment about whether the child's performance was deemed valid? Is it a good representation of their day-to-day functioning? Are there comments about underestimating the child's abilities? Then, now that you have this knowledge, what type of tool was used? Was it a screening measure or was it a comprehensive evaluation of the child's intellectual functioning? And then lastly, because you may be seeing children who have multiple evaluations spanning multiple years, are there discrepancies between this evaluation that you have now and the ones that they had prior? And ask yourself why that would be, right? Again, if it's the difference is we used a screener this time versus a comprehensive measure last time, then we want to take that into consideration and it's important to think about. Also important to think about, maybe it was the timing of the first evaluation versus now the child's been in a stable placement for a year, they've been in school for a year, and things may have improved.
As a psychologist with Texas Children's Foster Care Clinic, I see the challenges related to doing these assessments each and every day. For our kids in foster care, it is extremely hard to get previous records. They often are moving from different placements, which results in inconsistencies between reporters. In addition, we have limited developmental knowledge. And again, IDD is a developmental disorder. So one of the hallmark criteria of this disorder is knowing that developmental knowledge. I know that it is extremely difficult to get this history, and it is imperative that we get this information to be able to provide accurate diagnoses and to reduce the negative impacts of repeated testing. Just like if a child had previous MRIs at another hospital group, we would do our due diligence to get those records so we didn't expose them to additional radiation to get additional MRIs. Similarly, there are negative impacts of repeated assessments. And this is because IQ is a relatively stable construct. And the research is quite clear that after around the age of 7, the IQ is pretty stable. So similarly, as an adult, when I go to my primary care provider, they take my weight at each visit, but they only measured my height at the very first visit. And this is because as an adult, as much as I would like to think I could grow taller, I will not grow taller. I am stably at my height, but unfortunately, weight does vary. So we assess weight at each visit. Similarly, for children, their IQ is relatively stable after the age of 7. So we don't need to repeatedly test them each and every year because it's stable. Whereas something like adaptive functioning or their doing skills can change over time. So there's certainly times when repeated assessment would be warranted. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, what's the harm of repeated assessments or getting that psych eval done each year? Well, there's something called practice effects. As Dr. Swick referenced, the intellectual assessments are activity-based. They are designed to measure a child's abilities to respond to novel situations. And when kids get practice, for instance, have repeated practice building 3D objects based on a 2D picture, they get better at it. So with repeated assessment, we get practice effects. And we can see that with those yearly evaluations, kiddos' IQ scores slightly increase, not because there is a profound shift in their innate abilities. It's just because they've seen these blocks before and they know how to do it. Unfortunately, with this, for our kiddos, especially who are really at that borderline level, by repeatedly testing them, we can, and we have seen that we may test them out of getting lifelong services. Again, not because their intellectual functioning improved, instead because we just tested them so much. Now, there's absolutely times, as I mentioned, that it would be appropriate to reassess. So we can do reassessments based on to determine how much a child has responded to different treatments. So if they're in life skills or speech, we can do repeated assessments of adaptive functioning to measure those treatment gains and inform additional interventions. The schools are really great at doing these assessments. We would also want to reassess a child, particularly related to their cognitive functioning, if they had a significant change in their presentation, if there was a profound regression or loss of skill, if they acquired a new medical condition like epilepsy or traumatic brain injury, then we certainly should re-engage with a psychological evaluation to determine the impacts. Now, there are times when we should not reassess. This includes based on a yearly basis. I can tell you that most people, if they ever get an IQ assessment, they've had one, because again, it's a stable construct. This idea of repeated yearly evaluations is not something that is done in best practices. So we shouldn't be reevaluating kids just to check a box. We also shouldn't be reevaluating kids because it's hard or we can't find prior assessments. Again, doing our due diligence so we don't expose children to practice effects are incredibly important.
As Dr. Hughes just explained, a lack of records can be incredibly challenging, and we don't want to compound that. So we often see a CPS transporter, HST, as the only person accompanying a kiddo to the IQ testing. That can be really difficult. Someone with as much information as possible, the caregiver, the ad litem, whoever's known the child the longest and seen the most of their behavior should accompany them. As Dr. Hughes also explained, repeat testing can artificially inflate a score. So if a child with IDD is in special education, the school is also doing testing. So you may have kids being tested twice in a month or multiple times a year. And we're not getting an accurate look at their cognitive functioning when we do that. A best practice is to make sure that you let a psychological provider know about any school testing and vice versa. You can provide the results of one IQ test or one evaluation to the other, so we're not repeating unnecessary tests. As Dr. Hughes stated, we don't want to do that to check a box, and that includes opening up placement options. We've had cases where the kid's IQ has made it difficult to find placement, and they've asked for repeated testing to try and get a higher score to open up placement options. That is a short-term solution that can have really long impacts, long-term impacts in lifelong services. Slide.
Now we'll get into how do we support youth with IDD in the child welfare system. I first want to highlight that we might not know, just based on a simple, short discussion with a child, if they have an intellectual disability. And this is because of the term masking, which is when individuals with disabilities attempt to either consciously or unconsciously suppress or hide their traits of the disability, so that they appear more kind of typical. And this is an incredibly effective coping mechanism because it can allow them to escape aversive situations. For instance, I do not speak French. If someone was speaking to me repeatedly in French, I would probably smile, nod my head, and say, okay, or oui, oui, just to get them to stop talking to me because I'm not understanding. Our kids with IDD do this each and every day. We are bombarding them with information that they do not understand, and it's aversive. And so what they do is they say, yes, okay, I understand, to allow them to escape that adversity. Now, again, that can be really confusing and frustrating for the grown-ups because the kids said they understood. But we need to make sure that we are completing these assessments to ensure that we are accurately identifying our kiddos. The goal of assessment and diagnosis is not to put a label on a kiddo, but instead to inform the ways in which we interact with these children. It's also incredibly important to note that kids with IDD in general are very vulnerable. When we couple that with children who've experienced complex neglect and trauma histories and who are in child welfare settings, they are even more vulnerable. One kind of quality of individuals with IDD is this kind of being generally gullible, can be easily tricked or socially swayed. They are often quite naive in social situations, have a strong desire to fit in, and can really quickly be led by others. I'm sure many of y'all know about the kind of forced or coercion or confessions that are kind of popular within the legal system. And that's because of this kind of easily talked into nature of individuals with IDD. Because of this kind of gullibility and their lack of awareness of risk, in the context of inadequate supervision settings like residential treatment centers or group homes, these kids are incredibly vulnerable to additional abuse and exploitation. Appropriate diagnosis also helps children secure appropriate services and supports, including school accommodations, in addition to some additional supports we'll speak about in a moment. It's also important to note that appropriate diagnosis can help us in response to the different interventions. And far too often our kiddos are over-medicated, and oftentimes the medications that providers are placing our kiddos on to address the behaviors that we're seeing actually have this response where kiddos' processing speeds and their cognitive functioning gets slower. We are essentially sedating kids who's already have slower brains, and we're just exacerbating the cognitive concerns. It's also really important to recognize that with appropriate diagnosis, we can hopefully reduce mislabeling and stigmatizing these youth. Far too often, we see that deficits are attributed to behavior problems, or children are identified as oppositional or defiant. Yet, it very well may be that a child does not understand, or their processing speed takes significantly longer for them to process. I want us all to kind of take a minute and think about a residential treatment center with a group of teens where just one of them has an intellectual disability. That means their intellectual and adaptive functioning skills are 2 standard deviations below their peers. So there is a profound difference in their abilities to respond. If the group of teens are given the instruction to go wash your hands and then sit at the table for dinner, our kiddo with an intellectual disability will take significantly longer to process that information and behaviorally respond. Because we are seeing it take additional time for them to process and behaviorally respond, far too often they're immediately kind of reprimanded and viewed as they're willfully non-compliant when they're just processing. Their brains are buffering. Additionally, as Dr. Swick mentioned, I'm sorry, these kiddos can have a hard time holding multiple things in their brain at once. So, for instance, if they're told to wash their hands and then sit at the table, they might just do the last thing. They might sit at the table. Again, they will be viewed as willfully oppositional and defiant, and oftentimes, especially in these settings, will get these punitive punishments like removal of privileges when their brains just function differently compared to their peers. It's also really important to note that our kiddos with IDD have troubles with transitions, and it is because their brains really need that consistency and predictability. So even fun surprises like pack your bags, we're going to Disney World can be very, very distressing. Now, when we're thinking about significant changes in their daily routines, like changes in placement or schools, it is even more important that we are giving them advanced notice, frequently checking in and providing additional supports as they go through any transitions. As it relates to treatments or how we can help, first and foremost, we need to get the appropriate diagnosis, and then we need to get our kiddos connected with the local intellectual and developmental disability authority, or the LIDA, which serves as the point of entry for government-based programs. And Ms. Black will go over some additional services in the upcoming slides. There are treatments that can help to improve individuals with IDD's adaptive behaviors. These include things like applied behavior analysis and parent management therapy, or PMT. These interventions are very behaviorally based, and they require active caregiver involvement. And this is because based on kiddos' cognitive functioning, they are not able to go to 1 hour talk therapy a week and plan and implement new or alternative behaviors. They need that in real time coaching, reinforcement, and adaptations to their behaviors to make any behavior changes. Also, because of both the cognitive and behavioral limitations of individuals with IDD, traditional talk therapy is likely not going to be effective at changing behavior. Instead, we need to make sure that we are individualizing treatments to ensure that we are targeting the concerning behaviors, but also adapting interventions based on a child's intellectual functioning, language abilities, and behavioral needs. There have been some interventions that have been adapted to help support individuals with IDD. One of those is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT. This is the most widely used and most effective treatment for childhood trauma, and there have been adaptations to TFCBT for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities to ensure that we are accurately addressing their trauma while also ensuring that we are delivering it in a very individualized manner.
Some additional considerations for judges and ad litems working with children and youth with IDD. We'll start with the ad litem legal duty. The legal duty an ad litem owes a client includes undivided loyalty, confidentiality, and competent representation. And that doesn't change because a youth has IDD, particularly when they're in those teenage years. Do the next slide. And we have an ethical duty. I hear attorneys often grappling with whether and when to supplant their own judgment for clients, particularly when they have IDD. The Family Code tells us that that's a very high bar. For attorneys, only if the client cannot express their objectives or form an attorney-client relationship at all can you offer a best interest determination. And then you have to tell the court that's what you're doing. This means if your client can express where they want to live or where they want to go to school, that's sufficient for you to pursue their objectives. If you're worried about a conflict between what the client wants and what's in their best interest, you can always ask for the appointment of a guardian ad litem. The most important thing is that you not remove the child's voice from the proceedings, and that voice is you. For judges and ad litems, just some tips on housing for young adults with IDD and emerging adults. As Dr. Hughes mentioned, the LIDA is the entry point for all publicly funded programs, and it's where you're going to find the programs like HCS, or Home and Community-Based Services. HCS is the primary housing and support Medicaid waiver program for people with IDD, and the LIDA is where they get enrolled. They conduct what's called a Determination of Intellectual Disability, a DID, and they review records and look at interviews and talk with caregivers, as well as doing their own cognitive testing to determine whether or not the person qualifies under their criteria, which is a little bit different than a medical criteria. At this point, a good tip, loop in your DFPS regional developmental disability specialist. They're in those teenage years, there's services, there are things that need to be happening so that when they reach that age of 18, we have things in place. You have to have that determination of intellectual disability for that home and community-based services. And as I said, it's a little bit different than the measures that Dr. Swick and Hughes laid out. In the home and community-based services program, you're eligible if you have a full-scale IQ of 69 or below, or 75 or below with what's called a related condition. A related condition can be anything that is associated with IDD. As Dr. Hughes described, sometimes we see that with autism spectrum disorder, that they're co-occurring. It can be any of those types of disorders, but it cannot include mental illness. And at this point, it's also time to loop in your DFPS regional SSI coordinator, so we get those applications in. There can be a 10 to 15 year waiting list for HCS homes. So we really want to get them on those lists early. But if we're nearing 18 and we are still years down on the wait list, the developmental disability coordinator can help you get what's called an aging out slot. And what that does is it just lets you skip the line so that you can get into home and community-based services rather than end up in a state institution. I'm not going to go over all of the HCS services, but this is just a list to show you it's not just housing. There's employment services and physical therapy and speech therapy. We often focus on lifetime housing because it's such a game changer for our kiddos, but they offer a host of other services. You can get HCS services even if they're in a foster home or with a biological relative. So you don't have to just use the housing benefit. There are other benefits as well. Who can be an HCS provider? Almost anyone. Existing HCS providers, we know there's some companies that have it, but foster homes can also become HCS providers, as can biological relatives. So if you have a foster parent with a young adult and they want to continue to care for that emerging adult, but are worried about resources, they can become an HCS provider and get that financial and behavioral support. Just to talk about guardianship quickly, it does require a court order per the Texas Estates Code. It's really important. I think people find this out later, and I've heard ad litems and CASA be surprised at this, but it removes all of your civil rights, your freedom of choice, self-determination, and your independence. And it assigns decision-making to a third party, the guardian. And it's very, very difficult to terminate, especially if you're a person with IDD. There is a mechanism if you're a judge and you believe that a young adult needs to be referred for a guardian, but hasn't when they reach the age of 18. You can extend your own jurisdiction on your own motion without the young adult's consent until that referral is made. We see in the family code, and we call it a dad's referral. That is now called the HHSC guardianship program. But for some reason, we haven't updated those terms. But essentially, that extended jurisdiction will terminate when guardianship is either denied or granted. While there's a pending guardianship application, we see this a lot. You're in a little bit of a legal limbo with regards to the extended jurisdiction. But if someone turns 18 without a legal guardian, they are still a legal adult with all the rights and privileges of any other 18-year-old, despite having an intellectual disability. That is true even if DFPS is still paying for their care. They become their own medical consenter, their own educational consenter, and their own financial manager. And we don't get to take those rights away absent a court order. Some guardianship myths. All clients with IDD require a guardian. And these myths are often born of our desire to protect people, but we still kind of buy into these myths. One is that guardianship is necessary if the caregiver wants to continue to support the kid. One is that it's necessary to address concerns about money. We don't want them to be financially taken advantage of. Another myth is that it's required to access Medicaid services like HCS. And we often hear that it's the only legal solution to protect the child. It's not the only legal solution. What are some guardianship alternatives, you may be asking? One is a supported decision-making agreement, an SDMA. And what that is basically just a contract between two people, between the young adult and whomever they designate as their supported decision maker. And it says, this is what I need help with, and this is what I think I've got on my own. This is a hyperlink on the slide that you can look in later that has a blank form on our website, and you can just go through with the kiddo and click what they think they need help with. But they're still their own decision maker. They're just getting some help. Another guardianship alternative is a power of attorney. And that essentially just allows someone to be in charge of whatever power you're designating. And finally, a way we can avoid guardianship, but still control and prevent financial issues is to have somebody become the representative payee or rep payee. And that's a person that the individual designates as the person that's going to get the SSI money. And that way we make sure that it goes first to their housing and to their living situation. And then at that point can kind of turn over the rest for an allowance. I will say something I really want everyone to consider is the downside of having the HCS provider, especially if it's a company, as the supported decision maker and rep payee. That's because it really puts a lot of power in the hands of the person who's getting the money. So if the young adult is in a host home or living with a relative or a foster parent, that's less likely to be a concern. But if they're in a brand new facility and it's a company and there's staff coming in and out, I want to be really careful about assigning a kind of a stranger all of that power. The biggest thing to remember is it's up to the young adult to choose that person. So sometimes we see the caseworker going, here, just sign this, it's going to be this person. It's really important that we let them choose the person they trust most. I know we can't talk about IDD without talking about special education, but it's such a large topic that I'm just going to provide some resources now. And there are other trainings that we can do and have done on special education. The two resources are my organization, Disability Rights Texas, has a manual and it's meant for parents. So it is easy and accessible and very easy to navigate. It's both, we have both hard copies and an online version at drtx.org. The other one is something called Rights Law, and it's a website created by a lawyer and his wife, who's a provider, mental health provider, and it talks families, parents, and attorneys through how to support a child through the special education process. It's an incredibly helpful website, and I recommend it. I'll hand this back over to Milbury. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Thank you so much, everyone. We don't have any open questions right now in the Q&A, but I encourage all the viewers to put some in if you have anything that you want to learn more about. I have a few that I jotted down while you all were presenting, so I'll kick us off with the Q&A portion. Dr. Hughes, you mentioned several types of treatment in slide 21. How do you all determine what the best type of treatment is for any child who has IDD?
That is a great question. And we really, at least within our clinic, we use a very individualized approach. So what are the problems? Are the primary problems that a kiddo is having a really hard time with toilet training? Or are they having significant nightmares? Are they getting up at night and hoarding and stealing food? And we identify the concerns, and then we take their cognitive, developmental, and behavioral history into account to use to determine the appropriate recommendations. There are really amazing treatments that work and work quickly. And so in terms of our clinic, we make sure that we're using evidence-based treatments. Our kids deserve better than to be kind of guinea pigs and testing new therapies. So we use what the science says works.
Thanks, Dr. Hughes. We do have a question that was just posted in the chat, which is, do you all have some guidance on how foster parents or relatives can become, it says HSA providers? I think maybe it's HCS. Kate, can you take that question, please?
Yeah, so you can find a company, an HCS company, to be a provider. There are plenty of existing ones. You can reach out to your LIDA, and they'll have also information about how to become an HCS provider. But when I have kiddos who have IDD who are nearing that 18 age, I always talk to foster parents about becoming an HCS provider because they often want to continue to help, but are worried about that financial impact.
Thank you. We have another question that's come in. The question is this: for rural locations, what are thoughts on virtual therapy for kiddos with IDD?
It can certainly be extremely difficult. Even in Houston, it can be extremely difficult to get our kiddos the services and supports that are needed. As I mentioned previously, any intervention with kids with IDD is going to be very behaviorally based and primarily having the caregiver as a part of the intervention. So the idea that a kiddo with IDD could sit on a computer and talk about their week and then talk about a change for the future is not very likely. But even within our clinic, we complete parent management training virtually, and it is quite effective. Again, we have the caregiver with them the entire time.
Thank you. I had a question that I believe is for Kate, which is it's just disheartening to see how long that wait list is for HCS homes. So my two questions are, is it still worth getting a child with IDD on a wait list for an HCS? And also, at what age can a child get in line for an aging out slot?
That's a great question. So it is always worth getting them on the wait list. The reason being, the legislature is who decides how many aging out slots there will be for foster kids. And while it's been pretty stable, we all know that things can change. So it's always a good idea to make sure they're in that traditional line in case aging out slots become more rare. The developmental disability specialist at DFPS will get you that aging out slot, and they usually prefer a referral around the age of 17. That way they can start collecting documents and do everything they need to do, ensuring you get that DID and all the other things that you need for that HCS slot. So that's the person you want to contact. That's the best expert on HCS aging out slots, is that DFPS disability specialist.
Kate, another question has come in. This is about wait lists. What are the 3 important wait lists for waivers for autistic kids, such as HHSC and Texas and other wait lists that are important to them? One is for help to go into an ARD. One, anyway, it sounds like the lists are quite long. Is that a question that that you feel like you can answer?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but there are other Medicaid waiver lists if that's the question. It's not just for IDD. There are Texas class and all these things. I highly recommend just Googling HHSC Medicaid waiver chart. They actually have a chart that compares all of the different Medicaid waiver programs and shows you if your kid has X, they can have Y service. It's incredibly helpful, and I refer to it all the time.
Thanks for sharing that resource. One last question in the chat. Can attorneys ad litem assist in obtaining SSI benefits? And what's a good resource on that for us, for ad litems to try to get that process started?
The best thing you can do is ensure that the CPS folks are on it. We are seeing increasing times as the federal government continues to lay folks off in the Social Security Administration. And so where we used to see maybe 6-month waiting list, we're now seeing 2 years. So it's really important that if you think that kid's going to need SSI, particularly as they age out, you start that at 14 or 15. Especially if our kids are on that Title IV funding, you want to move them over to the SSI funding. The SSI specialists, the regional specialists, are the ones who have the best contacts in the Social Security Administration, and they fill out that paperwork. I just recommend kind of regularly checking in, and at every court hearing, I'd say, okay, where are we with the Social Security application? Because sometimes it's quite lengthy, but we want to make sure we're getting it in time.
Thanks, Kate. I have one last question, which is, you talked about SDMA, supported decision-making agreements. Can you give a couple of examples?
Sure. So a supported decision-making agreement, for example, could say, I think I can make all of my financial decisions, but I get really confused at the doctor. So can you help me make my medical decisions? It also includes usually a release of information. And that means that the supporter can access the records and speak to the providers so they can give their best advice. So the role of the supporter is to say, I talked to your doctor, I looked at your records, these are your options, and this is what I would do if I were you. And so it can be anything. It can say, I think I got my living situation, but I'm a little worried about my finances. And you would sign the release for the bank information. So it's just a contract. You can write it out by hand, but we do have a blank one on drtx.org.
Thank you. That's a perfect way to close. Thank you so much, Kate, Dr. Hughes, and Dr. Swick. On behalf of the Children's Commission, I appreciate you all so much. Thank you for helping us get this information out. We encourage viewers to email any unanswered questions directly to the appropriate presenter. And Dr. Swick, if you can move us to the next slide, please. Thank you all for watching today's presentation. The State Bar has approved this course on representing children judges. Thanks in advance for your thoughts, and thank you so much again for joining us today for this webinar, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.